In the mid-90s, professional wrestling changed forever, not because of a new finishing move or a flashy pay-per-view spectacle, but because one man walked through a crowd, picked up a microphone, and made everyone question what was real. The New World Order didn't just shake up WCW, it rewired the entire industry. Here are the 6 members who made it happen, starting with the man who lit the match, Scott Hall, May 27, 1996. WCW and WWF are locked in a ratings war, both companies throwing money around like it's on fire, and fans are getting restless with the same old formula. Good guy beats bad guy. Pyro goes off, everyone goes home. And then one guy walks through a crowd and changes literally everything. Scott Hall didn't come out from the entrance ramp. He didn't have music. He pushed through the audience like some guy who bought a ticket and lost his mind. He grabbed a microphone and said 12 words that still give people chills. You know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. And nobody actually knew. Hall had just left the WWF where he'd been Razor Ramon, a multiple-time Intercontinental Champion, the guy who had that legendary ladder match against Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 10. Everyone recognized him instantly. But WCW didn't introduce him as a new signing. They presented him as an invader, someone who had crossed enemy lines. And they never explicitly named the WWF, which meant fans at home were genuinely wondering if this was a real cross-promotional attack. Here's where it gets interesting. Hall didn't just show up looking menacing. He dismissed the entire WCW roster as wannabes and then dropped the word we. Not I'm here, we, implying more were coming. That one pronoun did more heavy lifting than most wrestlers do in an entire career. Within weeks, Kevin Nash showed up and the two became the Outsiders. The name reinforced exactly what WCW wanted you to believe. These weren't employees. These were hostile forces attacking from the outside and tearing the company apart from within. Hall and Nash would hold the WCW World Tag Team Championship multiple times, but the titles were almost secondary. The real weapon was the vibe, and that vibe was almost entirely Scott Hall. His laid-back delivery, that effortless charisma, the way he'd just go, "Hey yo," and suddenly every person in the arena was paying attention. Hall's promos made the nWo feel cool and dangerous without ever tipping into cartoon villainy. He wasn't twirling a mustache. He was the guy at the bar who you knew could ruin your night but was too relaxed to bother. That energy became the entire aesthetic of the nWo and helped turn their merchandise into some of the best-selling shirts in wrestling history. The black and white, the spray paint. That all started with the tone Hall set on night one. Fan communities still argue about how much credit Hall deserves compared to Nash and Hogan. Some say Hogan's heel turn at Bash at the Beach was the real moment the nWo became legendary. Others point to Nash's backstage influence, but a lot of people, and I mean a lot, argue that Hall was the true architect. Not in terms of politics or power moves, but in terms of tone, presentation. The reason the nWo felt different from every other wrestling faction before it, there's also a bittersweet layer here that's impossible to ignore. Hall's personal struggles with addiction are well documented, and they kept him from the sustained main event run his talent deserved. The guy had more natural charisma in one promo than most wrestlers have in a lifetime. But what he built in those first few weeks on Nitro became the foundation of the most influential faction in wrestling history. He lit the match. Everything that followed was just the fire spreading. But the match needed fuel, and that fuel was about 7 feet tall with a very bad attitude. Kevin Nash. If Scott Hall was the spark, Kevin Nash was the gasoline. A 6'10" wall of muscle who showed up on the June 10, 1996 episode of Nitro, confronted WCW officials, and made it very clear that Hall's invasion wasn't a solo act. There were 2 of them now, and they had plans. Here's the thing about Nash, though. This wasn't his first time in WCW. Between 1990 and 1993, he'd wrestled there under names like Oz and Vinny Vegas, which are exactly as forgettable as they sound. He was basically a tall guy in a bad costume doing nothing interesting. Hey, I'm Oz. Like the Wizard. Get it? Nobody got it. Nobody cared. But then he went to the WWF, became Diesel, held the WWF World Heavyweight Championship, and suddenly everyone cared very much. So when he walked back into WCW in 1996 under his real name, he wasn't some repackaged gimmick. He was a former world champion with legitimate star power. 6 days after his Nitro debut, Nash made sure nobody could ignore the Outsiders. At the Great American Bash on June 16th, he grabbed commentator Eric Bischoff and hit him with a jackknife powerbomb off the stage. Not a wrestler. The head of WCW programming ragdolled off a platform on pay-per-view. It made the whole invasion feel genuinely dangerous, because the Outsiders weren't just targeting wrestlers. They were targeting the people running the company. Then came July 7th, Bash at the Beach, 1996. Nash and Hall stood across the ring from WCW's Best, waiting for their mystery partner. And when Hulk Hogan walked down that aisle and revealed himself as the third man, the New World Order officially existed. Nash was a founding member, not a recruit, not a late addition. Day one. And on camera, he was perfect for it. Nash had this laconic, too cool for school energy that made the nWo feel like the place you wanted to be. He dropped industry slang and dry one-liners while looking like he could snap anyone in half without raising his heart rate. The nWo needed someone who could be funny and terrifying at the same time, and Nash was exactly that. Later, he helped form the nWo Wolfpack, a sub-faction that split from Hogan's nWo Hollywood, and recruited major talents, including Sting in 1998, a cooler, babyface-leaning version of the nWo with its own red and black color scheme. Some fans loved it, others saw it as the beginning of the end, the moment the nWo stopped being one unstoppable force and became two diluted ones fighting each other for screen time. But here's where Nash's story gets complicated. Off camera, Kevin Nash wielded serious creative influence. And the single moment that encapsulates both his star power and the problems that came with it happened at Starrcade 1998, when Nash defeated Goldberg and ended the most famous undefeated streak in wrestling history. 173 wins, gone. To Kevin Nash, a booking decision debated and criticized for over 2 decades, largely because Nash allegedly had a hand in booking himself to go over. Whether that's entirely fair depends on who you ask, but the perception stuck. And in wrestling, perception is everything. The nWo's eventual overexpansion, the bloated rosters, the storylines that went nowhere, a lot of that gets tied back to Nash's backstage influence. He was the cool guy. He was also, depending on who's telling the story, the guy who helped steer WCW into an iceberg while looking fantastic doing it. That's the Kevin Nash paradox. Undeniable charisma, legitimate star power, one of the best talkers of his generation, and a trail of controversial decisions that many fans believe damaged WCW beyond repair. He made the nWo credible. He might have also helped make it unsustainable, but if Nash brought the muscle and the politics, the next member brought something far more valuable. He brought the biggest name in wrestling history, and he brought it crashing down on WCW's head. Hulk Hogan. For over a decade, Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestler. He was the wrestler, the red and yellow, the vitamins, the prayers, the leg drop heard round the world. For an entire generation of kids growing up in the 80s and early 90s, Hulk Hogan was basically Superman in a bandana, the hero, the man who always won because good always triumphs over evil. And by 1996, people were absolutely sick of it. Here's the thing about being a living superhero for that long. It works great when the audience believes in heroes. But by the mid-90s, wrestling fans wanted edge. They wanted attitude. They wanted characters that felt real, not Saturday morning cartoons flexing at them. Hogan's WCW run was a copy-paste of his WWF formula. Same promos, same matches, same let me tell you something, brother energy. The crowds were getting quieter. The cheers were getting thinner. Hogan's act was on life support and nobody had the guts to pull the plug. Then came July 7th, 1996. Bash at the Beach. The Outsiders, Hall and Nash, needed a mystery third man for their 6-man tag match. Fans speculated endlessly. Sting? Luger? Nobody. And I mean, literally 0 human beings on the planet expected what actually happened. Hulk Hogan walked out. The crowd popped. Of course they did. He's here to save the day. That's what Hulk Hogan does. Instead, he looked at Randy Savage lying in the ring and dropped the leg on him. Fans started throwing garbage into the ring. Cups, popcorn, drinks, actual trash raining down from every direction. This wasn't scripted. This was thousands of people experiencing genuine emotional betrayal in real time. The man who told them to say their prayers just sided with the invaders. It would be like finding out your childhood dog was secretly working for the mailman this entire time. But the leg drop wasn't even the real moment. The real moment was the promo. Hogan grabbed the microphone and tore apart everything he'd ever been. He told the fans their support meant nothing, called them trash, and then said the words that changed wrestling forever. This is the New World Order of wrestling. The commitment was total. Hogan burned his entire mythology to the ground and danced on the ashes, changed his name to Hollywood Hulk Hogan, swapped the red and yellow for black and white, started spray painting nWo on fallen opponents, on championship belts, on anything that represented WCW's authority. He framed his entire career as a hero as nothing more than pandering. As a lie, he told millions of kids because it made him money, which is, not ideal if you're one of those kids. And what made it work was that you could tell part of it was real. Hogan genuinely seemed relieved to stop pretending. The sneering, the arrogance, the contempt for the audience. It was way too convincing to be pure acting. He wasn't playing a character, he was showing you the version of himself he'd been hiding behind the vitamins and prayers. The commercial results were immediate. nWo merchandise flew off shelves. Nitro ratings surged. WCW was suddenly winning the Monday Night War, and Hogan was the biggest reason why. The heel turn didn't just save his career, it extended it by years. keeping him relevant to an audience that had been about 30 seconds away from forgetting he existed. But here's where it gets complicated. The same ego that made the turn so convincing also started poisoning the well. Hogan had always liked being the center of attention. As a babyface, fine. As the leader of the nWo, his need to stay on top started suffocating everyone around him. He positioned himself at the center of every major feud, held the world title for stretches that went on way too long, and younger performers who could have elevated the company got pushed aside because Hollywood Hogan needed to be in the main event. His matches during this era were, to put it diplomatically, not exactly five-star clinics. Same formulaic structure, just with more interference and more nWo members running in. It worked for ratings, sure, but it planted the seeds for the nWo's eventual stagnation. When one guy insists on being the sun, everyone else becomes a planet orbiting him, whether they like it or not. The greatest heel turn in wrestling history was also the beginning of the end. Hogan made the nWo legendary. But his refusal to ever truly step aside is one of the reasons it eventually collapsed under its own weight. But if Hogan represents the nWo at its most powerful, the next member represents it at its most versatile, X-Pac, Sean Waltman. Sean Waltman is the most important wrestler nobody ever puts in their top 10. And I can prove it. He's the only person in history who was a core member of both the nWo and D-Generation X, the two most influential factions of the entire Monday Night War. The same rebellious DNA running through both groups? That was him. He carried it from one company to the other like a virus. On the September 16, 1996 episode of Nitro, Waltman debuted as Six, making him one of the earliest additions to the nWo after the founding trio of Hall, Nash, and Hogan. The name was a stylized reference to being the sixth member, which is, actually kind of clever by wrestling naming standards. This is an industry that once named a man Bastion Booger, so the bar is underground. But Six wasn't just some random pickup. Before WCW, Waltman had been the 1-2-3 kid in the WWF and a member of the Clique, that backstage group with Hall, Nash, Shawn Michaels, and Triple H. So when Six showed up and immediately slotted in next to Hall and Nash, it wasn't just a storyline, it was the Clique reassembling on enemy territory. The nWo already felt like a WWF invasion. Adding another actual former WWF guy from the same backstage circle made that feeling even stronger. Here's the thing about Six that doesn't get talked about enough. He brought a cruiserweight dimension that literally nobody else in the group could offer. The nWo was built on heavyweights. Hogan, Nash, Hall, big dudes doing big dude things. Six was smaller, faster, and could actually fly around the ring. He held the WCW Cruiserweight Championship, proving the faction's influence wasn't limited to the main event scene. He eventually lost that title to Chris Jericho on Nitro in January 1997, but the point had already been made. The nWo had their hands in everything. In multi-man matches and beatdown segments, Six served a role nobody else could fill. He was the enforcer who could actually bump. His agility added a completely different visual rhythm to the group's attacks. Without him, every nWo segment would have just been three large men slowly punching someone. With him, there was speed, variety, and the sense that this faction could hurt you in ways you didn't expect. Now, here's where Waltman's career gets genuinely fascinating. After leaving WCW, he returned to the WWF in 1998 and rebranded as X-Pac, immediately joining D-Generation X. He went from one company's defining rebel faction to the other company's defining rebel faction. Same attitude, same energy, same middle finger to authority. He's the connective tissue of the entire Attitude Era across both promotions. The living proof that the nWo and DX were spiritual siblings born from the same clique mentality. Nobody else can claim that. Not Hall, not Nash, not Michaels. Only Waltman existed as a central figure in both. Fan discussions around Six tend to split into two camps. Some argue he was underutilized, that WCW should have pushed him harder as a singles threat instead of keeping him as the group's designated bump taker. Others see his utility player role as exactly what the nWo needed, a Swiss Army knife who could work any style and fill any gap in the card. Both sides have a point. And then there's the elephant in the room, the term X-Pac heat. It's become wrestling shorthand for when a crowd isn't booing your character. They're booing because they genuinely don't want to see you on their screen. Whether that label is fair or whether it actually applied during his nWo run is genuinely debated. Most people trace it to his later X-Pac years rather than his Six era. But the fact that the term exists at all, named specifically after him, is an interesting wrinkle in the legacy of a guy who was otherwise one of the most versatile performers of his generation. But if you think the nWo's power was limited to in-ring talent, wait until you hear about the man who handed them the keys to the entire company, Eric Bischoff. Every faction needs muscle. Every faction needs a mouthpiece. But the nWo had something no wrestling stable had ever really had before: a guy who literally ran the company. Eric Bischoff wasn't a wrestler. He wasn't a manager. He was the executive producer and president of WCW, the actual, real-life boss. And on November 18, 1996, Hulk Hogan walked out on Nitro and casually announced that Bischoff had joined the nWo. The Fox wasn't just guarding the henhouse. The Fox built the henhouse, hired the chickens, and then ate every single one of them. Here's what makes this so layered it almost breaks your brain. Before the reveal, Bischoff had been playing the loyal WCW authority figure on television. He confronted the outsiders. He stood up to them. On an episode of Nitro in June 1996, Kevin Nash jackknife powerbombed him off the stage. Off the stage, Bischoff sold it like he'd been murdered. He looked like a victim. He looked like a man who'd sacrifice his body for WCW. And then, a few months later, he's standing next to Hogan wearing black and white. The betrayal hit different because the setup was so convincing. Nobody suspected the guy who got powerbombed into the Shadow Realm was secretly working with the people who powerbombed him. That's not just good storytelling. That's genuinely evil booking, which is, not ideal for the people who trusted him. But here's where it gets really meta. Bischoff wasn't just playing a corrupt executive on television, he was the actual executive who made the nWo happen in the first place. He signed Hall and Nash. He greenlit the Outsiders invasion. He approved Hogan's heel turn. Every single domino that fell to create the nWo was pushed by Bischoff's hand behind the scenes. So when he joined the group on screen, it wasn't just a character twist. It was reality folding in on itself. The man who created the monster became part of the monster, and somehow that made the monster scarier. Once he was officially nWo, Bischoff weaponized his kayfabe authority in ways that made the faction feel genuinely unstoppable. He negotiated contracts that favored nWo members. He created match stipulations designed to protect them. He shielded them from consequences. If you were a WCW loyalist, you weren't just fighting Hall, Nash, and Hogan in the ring. You were fighting the system itself. The boss was corrupt, the rules were rigged, and there was zero recourse. It was like filing a complaint with HR when HR is the one stealing your lunch. And this is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Bischoff essentially invented the heel authority figure archetype, the corrupt boss who abuses executive power to torment popular wrestlers. That was Bischoff first. Vince McMahon's Mr. McMahon character, the one that fueled the entire Attitude Era and the Stone Cold Steve Austin rivalry, came after. McMahon took that concept and arguably perfected it, but the blueprint was Bischoff's. Fan communities still debate which heel executive was more effective, and honestly, it's closer than most people think. McMahon had a better foil in Austin, but Bischoff had the advantage of being genuinely in charge of a real company while playing the role. That self-referential quality gave his version a texture that was impossible to replicate. But there's a tragic irony buried in all of this. The same creative boldness that built the nWo may have been what destroyed WCW. Bischoff's later decisions tell a cautionary tale. He overexpanded nWo membership until the group had so many people it stopped feeling special. He approved convoluted sub-factions that confused casual viewers. He extended the Angle years beyond its natural peak, because it had worked so well that he couldn't imagine letting it go. The nWo went from being the hottest thing in wrestling to being the thing that was on every single segment of every single show, and eventually, audiences stopped caring. His close identification with the faction may have blinded him to the risks of overexposure. When you're the guy who created it, the guy who runs the company, and the guy who's on screen representing it, there's nobody left to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, maybe we should try something else. Bischoff is the only non-wrestler in the Core 6, and that's exactly what makes him fascinating. He proved that a suit could be just as compelling as a suplex, and that institutional corruption could be just as threatening as a jackknife powerbomb. He also proved that sometimes the person most dangerous to a company isn't the invader at the gate. It's the executive who opened the gate and pretended to be surprised. But if Bischoff was the corporate brain of the nWo, the next member brought something entirely different. Pure, unhinged intensity with decades of personal history fueling every decision. Randy Savage. Here's the thing about Randy Savage joining the nWo. Every other member we've talked about made sense in the moment. Hall and Nash were outsiders by design. Hogan wanted to burn his legacy down. Six was a clique loyalist following his boys. Bischoff was a power-hungry executive playing both sides. But Savage? Savage was supposed to be the guy who would never break, and that's exactly why his turn hit harder than all of them. At Super Brawl 7 in February 1997, Hollywood Hulk Hogan was defending the WCW World Heavyweight Championship against Roddy Piper. Main event, huge stakes. And in the closing moments, Randy Savage walked down, slipped Hogan an object, and helped him retain the title. Just like that, the Macho Man was nWo. Before this moment, Savage had been one of WCW's most visible heroes in the fight against the nWo. He'd tagged with Sting. He'd gone to war with faction members week after week, and that's the detail that makes the turn work so well. Because Savage didn't just wake up one morning and decide to be evil. His character had been slowly cracking under the weight of WCW's inability to actually win. Every time the good guys rallied, the nWo absorbed the blow and came back stronger. At some point, fighting a war you can't win stops feeling noble and starts feeling stupid. So Savage stopped fighting it. But here's where it gets complicated, and honestly, kind of beautiful. From a storytelling perspective, this wasn't just any guy joining Hogan's crew. This was the other half of the Mega Powers. If you know your wrestling history, Savage and Hogan's relationship in the WWF was one of the defining narratives of the late 1980s. Partners, brothers in arms. Then jealousy and paranoia tore it apart in one of the most emotionally charged storylines wrestling had ever produced. The whole thing imploded at WrestleMania 5 and became a blueprint for how to do a tag team breakup right. Now, fast forward almost a decade, same two men, completely different context. And Savage is willingly standing next to Hogan again, not as a partner in heroism, but as an accomplice in villainy. That's not just a heel turn, that's a full character thesis statement. The man who was destroyed by Hogan's ego in the 80s chose to serve that ego in the 90s. Whether you read it as resignation, pragmatism, or just pure self-destructive chaos, it worked on every level, and his personality made the whole arrangement feel like it could explode at any second. Savage was never a stable person. Not in kayfabe, not in promos, not in anything. He was intense in a way that made Hall and Nash's cool detachment look almost robotic by comparison. Hogan had swagger, Hall had charisma, Nash had presence, Savage had volatility. You genuinely believed any segment could end with him turning on everyone in the room. That unpredictability gave the group's internal dynamics attention they desperately needed by early 1997. His promo style also hit different. While Hogan delivered calculated speeches about Hollywood and Nash dropped dry one-liners, Savage was out there sounding like a man who'd been staring at the sun for 3 days straight. Which is, exactly what a villain faction needs. Following his alignment, Savage dove headfirst into a rivalry with Diamond Dallas Page that became one of the genuine highlights of late 90s WCW. DDP was the perfect foil, a self-made guy rising through the ranks on pure crowd support, representing everything the nWo was trying to crush. Their matches had real stakes, real heat, and real quality. The Spring Stampede 1997 bout alone is worth going back and watching if you never have. Now, some fans will argue that Savage got lost in the shuffle, and there's some truth to that. The nWo machine was so focused on Hogan's championship reign and Nash's backstage chess moves that Savage sometimes felt like a third wheel in a faction he should have been co-leading. But that almost makes it more interesting, doesn't it? Because Savage's turn wasn't about screen time or title reigns. It was about what it symbolized. The nWo didn't just beat WCW's heroes, they absorbed them. One by one, the biggest names in the company crossed the line, put on the black and white, and joined the very thing they'd sworn to destroy. And Randy Savage, the Macho Man, the guy who'd been betrayed by Hogan once before, and had every reason to never trust him again, walked right back into his orbit, willingly. That's not just a heel turn, that's proof that the nWo had already won. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.